Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in San Diego, California to cover the West 2018 conference, the West Coast's leading maritime conference and trade show. It's a partnership between AFCEA International and the United States Naval Institute, and we're honored to have with us the chairman of the United States Naval Institute, retired Admiral Jim Stavridis, who is not only the chairman here, but also the dean of the Fletcher School, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, destroyerman, Naval Academy graduate, intellect, PhD. Sir, thanks very, very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you in beautiful San Diego, Vago.
It really is. We are now in a naval era, is the acknowledgement. Time of air and space power. Obviously, the Army has a very important role, but when you look at some of the strategic competitors the United States is facing, whether in the form of a rising China, whether in the form of a revanchist Russia, naval power is in the forefront of that. The Naval Institute has been at the forefront of naval thinking since 1873. We have the visage of Admiral Warden looking down on us as we do this interview. Talk to us about the role of the Naval Institute at this time of reinvigorated naval thinking.
Yeah, let's recall the word naval is not just Navy. It is Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and our Merchant Marine, and all of those are at play here. And what the Naval Institute does is bring those services together and create a forum, essentially an open forum, that allows us to build intellectual capital to address these massive global challenges. And at the top of the list, I would say the rise of China and the return of Russia. We're headed back to where we were 100 years ago. Great power politics. Let's hope we can avoid a global war, which occurred 100 years ago. Doing so will require the kind of intellectual capital we build here at the U.S. Naval Institute.
And what are some of the specific things you're doing? At the time the Institute was formed, Alfred Thayer Mahan was writing this whole idea of a Mahanian engagement at sea, big fleet confrontation, whereas now we're looking at a much more diverse set of challenges, gray zone, little blue men, little green men as well. Talk to us about the role of and what are some of the specific forums and projects you have ongoing to foster this broad range of innovative thinking?
I'll give you three that I think really matter. One is right here. It's bringing together industry, the private sector, alongside the sea services. So there can be an open flow, a kind of permeable membrane between those two entities, that private-public cooperation so that our forces get what they need to create deterrence and conduct the warfighting they have to do. So that's point one. It's conferences, private-public. Second, it's the intellectual capital I mentioned earlier in the form of the Proceedings magazine, Naval History, great lessons from history, the 80 books a year we publish at the U.S. Naval Institute Press. Creating that open forum encourages bright young people, and I really underline the word young, to get into that forum, because no one of us, Vago, is as smart as all of us thinking together. So number two is creating that forum. And then third, and I think equally importantly, is disseminating that information, being a transmission belt that tells the American public about why the sea services matter in creating security.
Do you, in terms of innovation, that's something that you focused on, throughout your career, you've thought was interesting. There's a lot of conversation and discussion in that. We heard that from Pat Shanahan, the Deputy Defense Secretary. We heard it from Hondo Geertz. We're going to hear it from the chiefs, Admiral Richardson, Commandant Neller, and then Commandant Zukunft are all going to be here talking this afternoon at an extraordinary panel of maritime, naval, and marine leaders. Talk to us a little bit about innovation, what works, what doesn't. At this time, folks are looking like, well, we may not be as much of a time of experimentation. We have to be much more focused on execution. There are others who say, well, wait a minute, we heard from Scott Swift, the Pacific Fleet Commander, about the Battle Force experiment is back, and we're out there and working on very, very big challenges. Talk to us about the right way of harnessing and thinking about innovation in this period.
I will. Let me take you back to 9/11. So 9/11 hits. Up until that point, we thought we were in a kind of new world, post-Cold War. A lot of tension had gone down. Suddenly we see this emergence of violent extremism, and we really had to retool the sea services for their part in what became known as the global war on terror. That required massive level of innovation. That was 17 years ago, 9/11. Today, I would argue we're at a significant similar inflection point going the other way, back toward the rise of China, the return of Russia, creates a moment where we need innovation again because we have not maintained those deep, core, hard warfighting skills. Our opponents are using cyber, unmanned vehicles, and special forces, little blue men, if you will. With great creativity, we need an equal level of innovation if we're going to respond.
Let me ask you about the unfortunate incidents last year. You were a commanding officer of USS Barry. I'm looking at Destroyer Captain right now, which was a great book, DDG 52. And you had a reputation for being a formidable ship driver before you went on to the land of admirals. Talk to us a little bit about your impressions on the root causes and the remedies for those tragic incidents. We had Admiral Davidson did his review. Then we had the Strategic Readiness Review by Gary Roughead and Michael Baer. We had the CDA, Admiral Caldwell has also weighed into this, the naval reactors. Talk to us a little bit, though, from your standpoint. What happened and what's the potential solution?
First of all, there is no silver bullet here. There's neither one single cause, nor is there, therefore, one single solution. But I'll give you 4 things that I think leap out at me. The first is leadership. There were leadership failures on the deck plates in those ships and leadership failures in the Admiralty. And I think the reviews do a good job of apportioning the responsibility. So leadership. Number 2, equipment. We can ensure that our equipment is better, smarter. We can apply artificial intelligence. We can do simple things like letting civilian mariners know where our ships are in a benign channel passage. So I think equipment is part of it. Third is training. We need to constantly put the resources into training the surface Navy the way we have historically done so for the submarine force and for aviators. We have always been the poor cousins in the surface Navy in terms of hours and resources. That needs to be improved. And lastly, Vago, I think there is some part of this that is an op-tempo problem. When you put so much burden on a handful of forward-deployed ships, I think it becomes, as we used to say in the Soviet Union, no coincidence, comrade. When you start seeing these kind of accidents, it's not only the 2 collisions, but a grounding and other significant accidents in those forward-deployed, high op-tempo ships. We've got to get some balance in the demand signal we put on those ships. So no one single cause. I think all those things contributed. We're going to have to unpackage all of that and make it better.
Was it an error to bring manslaughter charges against those crews at a time when folks are concerned that the Navy has too risk-averse a culture fundamentally? Does that reinforce a worry that the force will become even more risk-averse in the future?
I think always you have to balance the need for accountability, and I'm very proud, broadly speaking, of the Navy's response in demanding accountability from the lowest levels on the deck plates to the highest levels at the 4-star level. I think that's the right reaction. So you want that accountability, but as you say, you don't want a chilling effect, particularly at that 05 commanding officer level. It's a very delicate balance. I think that this particular instance on the negligent homicide charges is an overreach. I do not think we'll attain a conviction on those. I think the lesser charges would have been sufficient, but at the end of the day, the balance was slightly on the side of accountability, and I respect that decision.
Let me ask you about the administration's first year in office. There were a lot of concerns. You enumerated some of those about the importance of allies and on American first, and you've written about that. Talk to us. It's been a year now that the administration has been in position. You know, you were a tough grader when you were in the Navy. You were a tough grader as an academic. How would you grade the first year when it comes to international and defense policy for the new administration?
Yeah, let's leave domestic policy aside, but let's talk about things I focus on. So I'll give you some wins and some losses. I'll start with the wins. I think the administration has turned out to be capable of using allies, partners, and friends. NATO, as it turns out, is not obsolete. What a shock. The administration has morphed its positions to use our allies not only in NATO, but Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. So I give good marks for using allies, partners, and friends. Secondly, I think the administration has done a reasonably good job responding to North Korea, building a coherent case against them. There's been a little bit of overblown rhetoric at times, but I think overall we are responding well in North Korea. And thirdly, one that I think has gone reasonably well is our relationships in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is an area that's been ignored too often, but this administration has begun to try and reach out and do a bit more. We've sent Secretary Tillerson down there. We're preparing for a meltdown in Venezuela. So I think there have been some wins. I'll give you three big losses in my view. Pulling out of the climate accords. We're the only nation in the world now out of 190 nations who are not in the Paris Climate Agreement. That's a leadership failure, and I would argue a scientific failure not to recognize climate change. I think it's a reality. Number two, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, a leadership mistake. Here we had an opportunity to build a coherent community. China would have been outside of it. We've lost that, and that former U.S.-led group is now going ahead without us. And thirdly, I don't think we put enough emphasis on cyber and cybersecurity. That continues, in my view, to be the number one threat we face. We still don't have a significant voice in the Trump cabinet who is focused on cyber, and I think we are headed for a big cyber event. We haven't done enough internationally in that zone. So, as for all administrations, it's a mixed picture. Could have been worse. There are some areas for improvement. Let's see what happens in year two.
And I should have noted that you were also Southcom, so and fluent in Spanish. So that was certainly one of your old AORs. Two questions, because you've been very generous with your time. North Korea, a lot of discussion about the bloody nose strategy, about whether or not that would be effective. The North Koreans have been very effective at trying to drive a wedge between us and kind of a receptive South Korea that was a little bit concerned with some of the rhetoric that was coming out of the administration, however helpful that may have been in terms of driving sanctions and other things. From your standpoint, bloody nose strategy, good idea or bad idea?
It's not a good idea or a bad idea. It's a terrible idea, because we would not be able to control the impulse to escalation which would emerge. Kim Jong-un would find it irresistible to react, and he really has a limited tool set. All of them, artillery barrages, for example, special forces flooding the zone in northern South Korea, all of those would require an escalatory response by the United States, and we would almost for certain be off to a war that would kill 2 to 4 million people on the Korean Peninsula. It's a terrible idea. What we should be doing is using this sliver of an opening being provided by the Olympics to go from two-party talks, which are happening now, North Korea, South Korea, make those four-party talks, bring United States and China into the mix. China has to be part of the solution. All roads to Pyongyang lead through Beijing in the end.
Last question about the military parade. You wrote a piece in Time magazine. The president wanted a military parade at the inauguration. It didn't happen, according to news reports. With seeing Bastille Day celebration, and the French put on an extraordinary military show down the Champs-Élysées, complete with airplanes and legionnaires, Foreign Legion leading the rear or ending the parade. Talk to us a little bit about why you thought that's a bad idea. You wrote in Time magazine about that. Why, from your standpoint, as somebody who spent almost 4 decades of your life in uniform, is that not a good idea?
So I started marching in parades in 1972 when I went to the U.S. Naval Academy, and like pretty much everybody who's marching in a parade, I hate marching in parades, so I have a bias. But I'll give you 3 reasons I don't think a parade like the president has described is a good idea. Number one, it takes away a weekend, because these things always happen on the 4th of July, Memorial Day, or Veterans Day. So all the troops are going to lose that long weekend. The troops are going to have to clean up the city, set up the stands, create the security cordons, conduct the marching, move all the equipment, then strike it all down. By the time they're done with that and the rehearsals and the planning, they've lost their weekend. That's too bad. Number 2 is the fact that it's a terrible signal to send. You mentioned the French. Let's really talk about who does these kind of parades. It's North Korea. It's the old Soviet Union. It's the current Russia. It's China. It's authoritarian regimes with a chip on their shoulders who feel they have to show the world how tough they are. That's not the United States of America. We have the most lethal, professional armed forces in the world, full stop. We don't need a parade to demonstrate it. And then finally, we're in a budget crunch. Why would we want to spend resources on a parade like this? Let's take those resources, and these are tens of millions of dollars, and put it into the VA, into making our military cemeteries perfect, into daycare centers for our military families. We have got a lot better uses for every nickel, let alone tens of millions of dollars, than to put it into a parade that we don't need to signal in an era in which we are the best military in the world. We don't need a parade to demonstrate that.
Admiral Stavridis, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much. And
Thank you.
and looking forward to talking to you again about strategy and other
I'd
things.
love to do it. Thanks so much, Vago. Perfect.